Welcome to the Food Startups Podcast.
We're really excited because we have Rich Cohen on the podcast today. He wrote the book that we've mentioned more than any other, The Fish Who Ate the Whale.
Yeah, it's going to be an excellent opportunity for us to get a behind-the-scenes look at the Sam Zemurray character that's featured in the book. I've been super busy watching old episodes of Shark Tank lately and checking out the startup scene. I'm getting ready for a trip to New York, and I've been hearing that food startups are getting hotter and hotter. Have you been hearing the same thing?
I've been seeing it. I get links sent to me from friends and family all the time about things going on in New York. I saw that an article that I think you may have sent me this morning about the pantry's smart fridge.
Yeah, that was really cool. When we talk about food startups, oftentimes we think it's just about the actual food and the food manufacturing, but there's this whole infrastructure that goes into these new food trends. We're talking about different machinery that needs to be manufactured and companies that are doing that. Different services, delivery services are blowing up. One of my favorite companies that received funding on Shark Tank and is led by an alumni from my college, Plated, has grown their offices down in downtown Manhattan to a very large extent, and they're really blasting off. And Pantry is a new company that uses RFID technology to make vending machines that are for fresh food, that are nice and automatic and sleek. It's pretty interesting stuff, man.
Yeah, and I would say looking at the photo here, it's pretty much like a regular large refrigerator that has the function of vending and sales.
Yeah, and link up to the photo. It looks pretty cool. It's like a sleek next generation cooler, I guess. These refrigerators in college campuses, in hospitals, and also in restaurants that serve lunch, where if they get a big rush of lunch people, they can put fresh sandwiches, fresh juices in areas in this refrigerator where when people buy them, they swipe credit card. There's all this technology that makes that transaction totally automatic.
That's amazing. This to me seems like most ideas, we'll see if it has success, but if it catches on, this to me seems like an idea that could be copied. Danny, I go to a lot of big Bogota offices, and there are a lot of places like in Regis where they have healthier and somewhat better snacks there, but they always have to get someone to come to the refrigerator that has a lock on it, unlock it, accept the money, give change, etc. So this seems like a really great idea, and I wish them the best of luck.
Now, Matt, I'm pretty excited about the guest today. Do you want to go ahead and give the intro?
Today, we have Rich Cohen, a New York Times best-selling author who grew up on the North Shore of Chicago, where he died with the Cubs and was reborn with the Bears. He has written 10 books and a host of magazine articles for, among others, The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Harper's Magazine, and Vanity Fair. Rich, how's it going today?
It's going good.
Great, Rich. Well, to start off the interview, can you tell the listeners who may not be familiar with the Banana Man how you learned about him and what inspired you to write the book on Sam Zemurray?
Well, I went to Tulane, which is in New Orleans, Louisiana, and soon after I got there, I noticed that the name Zemurray was on just about every building, and I became interested in this guy. I had no idea who he was, and then the president of Tulane's house, the university president, was Sam Zemurray's house, and it's like the most beautiful house in New Orleans on St. Charles Avenue, across from Audubon Park. And there was a function there, and you go into that house, and it's like going back in time to this day of these Banana Kings. And the house is still sort of filled with maps of steamship routes that United Fruit used to follow in Central America. And I just became really interested in this guy. And I found out that he was really the benefactor of my school. And he was this very shadowy figure that no one knew a lot about, but the people that worked at the school were very interested in. His name was Sam Zemurray. He was a Russian Jewish immigrant to Selma, Alabama, early in the late 1800s, 1890. And he went from literally coming with nothing to being one of the most powerful men in the world who owned and ran United Fruit. And he was one of the guys that helped make bananas ubiquitous in our country.
And so Sam Zemurray ended up living a large part of his life in New Orleans. Is that right? He ended up settling down there after becoming successful?
Yeah, well, he first was in Selma, Alabama, and he kind of followed the banana trade to the cities he had to go to. So he moved from Selma to Mobile, where the Boston Fruit, which became United Fruit ships, came in. And then as he got more successful, he moved to New Orleans, which was the center. There were really two capitals of the banana trade, Boston, where United Fruit really began as Boston Fruit with a Wellfleet Cape Cod fisherman. And the other one was New Orleans, where it was really built up by a few companies led by Zemurray. And he wound up kind of being peripatetic is the word I would use. He didn't really have a single home. I guess you'd call it New Orleans. But he lived a lot of the year in Honduras, a lot of the year in New Orleans, a lot of the year in Boston, because he ultimately took over United Fruit. That's how he became the fish that ate the whale. That's what my book was called. And then in New York, because the company eventually moved its headquarters to one of the piers in Lower Manhattan.
Gotcha. And all right, in The Fish That Ate the Whale, I got the idea that Sam Zemurray was kind of a hard person to know or figure out, that he was this huge figure, but sometimes felt a little bit out of place. And my question for you, did you get a good idea of kind of what made him this successful entrepreneur? If you had to point to a few things, or did you just kind of see these boundless qualities around him that you knew were kind of important to his success?
I think he's like a real case of character is destiny. And in everything that he did, you saw his character for good and for bad. He was very ambitious and he was very smart. And he just saw things that other people didn't. And by the time he showed up in the banana business, it was a second generation business. The founders were out of it. And it was being run by guys who went to business schools and Ivy League guys. And this was a big, tough Russian guy who spoke. They always said about him he could swear in 5 different languages. And you saw value where other people saw junk. So the way he got started in the business is he didn't have any money to go into the business. But when he went down to Mobile, he realized that they were sorting the bananas into different piles, putting them on different trains. And when all the trains left, there were these bananas that were left behind. And he asked one of the managers for United Fruit, what are those? And they said, those are the ripes. And he said, what's a ripe? And they said, well, the definition is if a banana has 1 freckle on it, it's designated a turning. If it has 2, it's designated a ripe. And he said, what do you do with them? He said, well, we just throw them out. They're garbage. You can't get them into the market before they rot. And he bought those ripes almost for nothing. And he built his first fortune on selling bananas that were considered garbage by everybody else.
Right. And in that way, he kind of, I guess in some way, he carved out, we talk about this a lot on the show, he carved out a niche for himself, it sounds like, because he was dealing with a part of the market that the big companies fundamentally didn't want.
Yeah, well, that they didn't even recognize because it was so much work for so little. It reminds me of a story I once read about a guy that counterfeited $1 bills. And they could never catch him because it cost like 80 cents to counterfeit each bill. And it was like the volume had to be so great to make money on ripes that it wasn't worth it for the big companies. That's why they threw him out. But he ultimately, it gave him a foothold into the business, and he ultimately made enough money that he was able to then build a different kind of business that ultimately he grew greens, and he then went directly head to head with United Fruit and ended taking it over. But the irony is United Fruit sold him this stuff because it was garbage, and he used their garbage to take over their company 20 years later.
Yeah, and it also happened with a while back with operating systems with Microsoft and IBM. The same idea, like this software is junk and building into a $1 billion operating system.
Yeah, I mean, basically when the last book I wrote was about the 1985 Chicago Bears, and it's to me, it's a parallel because the Chicago Bears built the defense, to beat the offenses of their time. And the offenses had become kind of arrogant, having their way with defenses. And when that happens, when people get kind of lazy, it opens a big opportunity for other people to come in and kind of completely rewrite the game. That's what Zemurray did. That's what the Bears did. I mean, so to me, you ask what Sam Zemurray was like. You can tell what he's like. It's like the thing from the Bible. You know him by his fruits. And literally in this case, you could tell what he's like by what he did, by that. And there was millions of things like that he did. He got in a big fight with United Fruit over both trying to buy a piece of land on the border between Guatemala and Honduras. And the problem was legally 2 different legal owners. And United Fruit spent a lot of money and a lot of time researching who the legal owner was so they could buy it. And while they were doing that, Zemurray just went and bought it from both of them. It's like cutting the Gordian knot. That's what he was like. He was very practical. He was very simple, and he saw his way to the easiest, most direct solution.
Absolutely. Now, I think that's really interesting what you said just about the product just showing who the person was in a nutshell. And you can kind of understand that folks from certain demographics or backgrounds, they won't be dealing with bananas on this, with rotting bananas or future soon to be rotting bananas. Now, one thing I've always wondered about is that you always hear about incredible entrepreneurs that they come in all different kind of colors and sizes, I would say. But there's one quote that I know Matt and I kind of looked at closely in the book, and it kind of talks about how tycoons put people into their confidence or do not bring people into their confidence. That quote is, "The best tycoons are like magicians. They know when to share information and when to withhold." So the question for you that Matt and I have is kind of how can food startups with aspirations of building an empire, it's a hard question to ask, but how can they develop this skill for knowing who to coddle or who to help out, who to share information with, and then also when to not step into kind of enemy territory, I would say?
Well, I think some of it's just instinct. I guess you can study it. And one of the things that was always interesting about Zemurray was he really trusted people. I mean, he was kind of a secretive guy in a way, but his whole thing was when you hire somebody, you let them do their job. And if you don't trust them, you fire them and get somebody you do trust and let them do their job. And he had his business, because it was operating in so many different countries, really depended on letting the local guys, the people who were there, because they knew the conditions and he didn't know the conditions. And I guess one of the really big lessons for me from him was sort of a kind of humility, knowing what you can't know and knowing when to sort of say, I can't make this decision because I just don't have enough information. I'm not there. I don't understand. And I'm going to find somebody who does and have them explain it to me. And that was an amazing thing about him. He was dealing with United Fruit. That was a top-down business that was run out of Boston. And Boston was giving orders to guys in Colombia, Honduras, Guatemala, telling them how many bananas to grow, telling them what fees to pay. And ultimately it made them very, very weak because they had no sense of what was happening on the ground.
Right. Now, is he the type of guy, I'm not sure, but these types of guys who are trustworthy, it seems like when they're crossed, they never trust the same person again. Or like you said, you don't trust them, they fire you. So was he very much like that in terms of you were either on his side or you weren't and you were gone?
I never got a sense that he was a vindictive person or a mean person. I mean, my father wrote a book when I was a kid called You Can Negotiate Anything. And his whole thing is that all business, you should look at it as a game. And you should care, but not care that much. And if you play it that way, you'll have fun at it and you can win at it. And I think Zemurray was that naturally. He was competitive, and it was a kind of game to him. And there were definitely times when you could see he was angered. I mean, he was angered when the guys from Boston Fruit regarded him as kind of a moron and an idiot because he was a foreigner and he wasn't schooled. And they kind of made fun of him, and that really angered him in a personal way. But other than that, I think he had the ability to sort of look at it as a kind of a game, a sport. And that meant that he really wasn't a very vindictive or mean person. And the people loyal to him, the people who were with him, they loved him. I mean, you could talk to them, the people who are still alive, and they spoke of him like you never hear anybody spoken of. And one of the amazing things coming across is there's an exchange of letters that it existed between Felix Frankfurter and Franklin Roosevelt, just back and forth about Sam Zemurray and what an amazing person he was to deal with.
Wow. That's amazing that Roosevelt held him in such high esteem. I wanted to transition a little bit because you're talking about Zemurray treating things as a game, how that can be advantageous to an entrepreneur that maybe cares too much, takes things too personal. Now, I know you visited Honduras in writing this book. I wanted to know if you went anywhere else in Latin America, and if you could talk about the overall impact he left on these countries.
I was in Ecuador, I was in Guatemala, and New Orleans, which is really the most important place for him. because it really was his home, and where all the sort of archives of the company are at Tulane, all still at Tulane. But the place I really spent time was Honduras. And I mean, it's interesting about Honduras because he had a huge impact and also no impact. I mean, United Fruit, what at one point was like, I don't know what percentage of that economy, but 50% of the economy. In Guatemala, they owned 2/3 of the roads, actually, or something. 2/3 of the private property they owned. And they owned the roads to the Pacific Ocean. But when they left, they kind of left nothing behind. And a lot of the places that were the United Fruit compounds, they've either rotted or just been left to grow back into grass, or they become kind of gated communities and suburbs. And it's a very strange thing. It's like the end of the movie The Treasure of Sierra Madre, when they go up into the mountains and they get all the gold, and the end of the movie is all the gold blows away. And you're right back where you start. So he did a tremendous amount in Honduras. He gave a lot of – there used to be a thing, and they said in New Orleans, which is if you want something from Sam Zemurray, ask for it in Spanish. And he built a lot of the power plants. He built a lot of the water treatment facilities. And he built the big agricultural school in Honduras. So he did leave a lot behind. But at the same time, it's such a strange business because it's the harvest. And when they left, a lot of things returned to how they had been.
Yeah, and things rot really quickly in Honduras in the tropics, right?
I mean, you read about these stories about before the Spanish came about there being these huge cities out in the jungle, and you wonder, how's that? Where are they? Where's the ruins of them? And then you watch basically 2 years go by, and what happens to a building? It disappears. So yeah, 10 years go by, that stuff's gone.
Definitely. I just had a quick follow-up for you. So it sounds like when I was reading the book, my parents are immigrants from Eastern Europe, and I had I felt like I had a little bit in common, or I'd like to kind of feel like I understood a little bit of what Sam Zemurray went through in kind of his in terms of his kind of personal identity. Do you think that being kind of an outsider, kind of touched on how he felt a little bit like an outsider at times, it kind of helped him get perspective, helped to give him drive rather than be an MBA, be this guy that was outside of everything and looking into it and had his own personal philosophy on how things should be?
Definitely. That was his whole story. I mean, obviously he had kind of immigrant eyes because he was an immigrant and he came from a wheat farm in Western Russia where nothing grew. He saw bananas as kind of a miracle. Now, you don't remember, but bananas were once like a kind of caviar. I mean, or some very fancy fruit you see at Whole Foods. They weren't what they became. These guys made it that way. I think in 1876, the centennial, they were selling bananas at 10 cents a slice. And that's when 10 cents was worth probably $2. So when he saw bananas, he recognized this tremendous value in them, and he recognized the value in the ripes, which to me, it's like he was a ripe. And he was a guy who that was his whole thing, recognizing value where nobody else sees anything. And that's become kind of more of a philosophy, I think, in business now. And you see it in books like Moneyball are kind of about that, about hidden value. But his whole thing was discovering hidden value. And so to me, that all came from this sensibility of being an immigrant and not having any money to go buy ships and go make deals with companies. He had to take what he could get virtually for free. And that was always his way in, and it was always his advantage. And it's what always gave him an advantage over these other guys, which is he saw the value of hard work. He saw the value of time. And he understood that what you might throw away, somebody else can go through and make a fortune out of.
Now, Matt, if I can just jump in, I have one more question because I think this is really interesting to me. Sam Zemurray, so he made it happen with the bananas in the sense that he created something that didn't exist, in a sense. He created this market that didn't exist. And whenever I see that, I always see that it's so hard to do. That after the fact, you're everyone thinks, oh yeah, ripe bananas, of course, that's obvious. You just take advantage of that really easily. But it was always actually incredibly hard to do. Do you think, and from your experience as an author and seeing various companies and how they function, various entrepreneurs, do these guys have to be just incredible salesmen and have to just have incredible self-confidence to make it happen? Or can you engineer this kind of having these values rise to the surface in maybe a different way?
I mean, I do think that the thing about Zemurray was, at the beginning is they said that he couldn't get it to the supermarket before it rotted, and he had something like 20 hours to sell it. So if you invest all your money in a product that if you don't sell in 20 hours, it turns into garbage, it will make you the greatest salesman in the world, or you'll be ruined. So basically, by necessity, he became a great, great salesman. I mean, I do think that probably some people are better at it than others, but I think that if you have to learn how to do it, you'll do it. It's the circumstances that change. And as far as Zemurray, I mean, he didn't have a chance to practice it. He didn't have a chance to learn it. He just had to go around and find out by doing. So, I mean, I think the lesson for him is almost he always put himself in situations where if he didn't succeed, he was done. So that's one way. You can go through life that way. It's probably pretty stressful unless you have a certain kind of temperament. But if you sort of constantly gamble everything, then you got to be great or you're going to be gone.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I would guess you're probably familiar with Robert Greene, and he talks about that in a lot of his books, like the 33 strategies of war, like the death ground strategy, or with like Cortez in Mexico and sinking the ship so there's nowhere to go but up. But yeah, well, really interesting. So, Rich, I wanted to touch another subject because this is the Food Startups podcast, and I'm glad we got to talk about Zemurray. But actually contacting you, I was looking at your bio, and I had no idea that you wrote this book about the Sweet and Low Empire. Now, I'm actually working with alternative natural sweeteners, so I have a personal interest in the question. But I also think for our listeners, because this is definitely a pretty hot trend when you go to the health and natural food shows in the U.S., the Sweet and Low Empire, since you had a very upfront and personal view of it, do you see any traits from the Sweet and Low business in Brooklyn, any traits that you could recommend to people if they want to develop their own alternative sweetener today in 2014?
I mean, the thing about my grandfather who invented the sugar packet and invented Sweet and Low is with Sweet and Low, he was following his own desire, which is when I look at people, that's often what happens. It's often how it works. When you try to think of things, try to think of something, it never really works. And in fact, so he was just a guy on a diet, and he had run a diner. And then if you're on a diet and you didn't want to eat sugar, they had these little cyclamate pills that were like little microscopic pills you could drop in your iced tea or whatever. And he wanted to be able to put sugar in his iced tea because he liked watching it come down. He liked the whole aesthetics of it. So he thought, why isn't there some artificial sugar that does that? And there wasn't. And he got together with a chemist, and they had all these different formulas, and they invented this product that he called Sweet and Low. And really, he did it because he wanted fake sugar, and he thought it would sell to diabetics at hospitals. That's all he had in mind, and he sold them to hospitals. And suddenly, he found out people were stealing them. And then people were calling the factory wanting to buy boxes because he was on a diet, and so was everybody else. And sort of, I guess my point is that if you're looking to build a new product or looking for a new anything, it's the same rule that it is with writing, which is you have to presume that if it's interesting for me, it's interesting for millions of other people. Because basically, I'm just like everybody else. And if you want it, a lot of other people are going to want it too. And you sort of start from that premise. If it's something you really want, there's probably a market for it.
Very cool, very cool. I've read many, many stories about entrepreneurs and much more in kind of niche segments these days that because of, and many times in the health foods, in the case of health foods, because they go through an experience and they rely on certain foods, they think it's a no-brainer that once they, let's say they're unhealthy and they become healthy, they want to share the diet. They want to share the superfood or whatever we're talking about. They want to share it with millions of people, and that drive leads them to success. So it's cool to hear about the origins of that story. And just to kind of give the name of the book is called Sweet and Low, A Family Story. And it's a really interesting read.
One guy looked in the mirror, thought he looked a little fat, and suddenly we're all getting these pink packets.
And guys, just to point out, so listeners here, we're going to link to all the books as well as a bio of Rich Cohen at foodstartupspodcast.com/banana. Now, Rich, we wanted to ask you, what are you working on right now, and what projects do you have planned for the future?
Yeah, I'm writing a bunch of magazine stories as I usually do, and thinking of writing a book about the Chicago Cubs, my team, that will finally solve the mystery of loss.
It's been a while, hasn't it? And how do you feel about the Bears this year?
It's topsy-turvydom for a Bears fan because suddenly they have a great offense and they can't stop anyone on defense. So I'm excited to watch them. I think they'll be fun to watch, but I think that it's very weird for Bears teams to win games like 45-43. It's like as if it was 80 degrees in February in Chicago.
Yeah, it might be a global warming that's happening over here. But no, that's really interesting. I read something that the Chicago Cubs, somebody, I think it was maybe David Ortiz, saying that the reason why the Cubs don't win is because of the day games. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's always what they said. They say that the problem with the day games is that it gives guys too much free time at night. They go out and they get drunk and then they can't perform the next day. That's why the day games are supposedly a problem. I've looked into this a lot. I think the one common denominator seems to be Wrigley Field, as far as I can tell. The Cubs were the best team in baseball before they moved into Wrigley Field in, I think, 1917 they moved in or something. They last won the World Series 1907, 1908. They won back-to-back. They moved into Wrigley Field like in 1915, 1917, and they have not won a World Series since they moved into Wrigley Field. So there's an issue with Wrigley Field, and it's very hard for Cubs fans to look at because we love Wrigley Field, but something seems tied up with that stadium that seems to be getting in the way. The last team to win in Wrigley Field was, in fact, the Bears. So,
Wow. Well, Rich, we'll definitely be on the lookout for that new book. And thank you so much for coming on today. It was really important for us because we'd both read the book independently and found out that the other had read it and gotten tons of insights and tons of inspiration from Sam Zemurray. So thanks again. And listeners, we're going to link everything on our website so you guys can check out his books as well.
Thanks. Great talking to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Rich. Definitely appreciate the time and hope that the listeners get a good wealth of, I know they will get a wealth of information from the book and from the podcast.
And as always, if you have any questions or comments, find us online at foodstartupspodcast.com.